It's about establishing a big picture vision of what you're trying to accomplish. In graphic design, you're trying to solve communication problems with words and pictures and color. In real estate, we're building these massive buildings or neighborhoods or districts. There's that element of scale, right? It's like there's the big picture. How do you take it all in?
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today, I'm speaking with Charlie Miller, principal at M5 Advisors. Charlie, thanks for chatting with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. I'm glad to be here.
Charlie, take us back. So before you were working on some pretty incredible projects in New York City, there's just young Charlie. Why buildings?
Why buildings? I have kind of a non-traditional path to commercial real estate and to real estate development. I was actually did my education in design and graphic design. I was always interested in visual design. And that's where I started my career. I was really interested in sort of the classic designers of the 50s and 60s doing really high fidelity corporate identity and logo work, all of the great American designers. And that led me to a career in design, graphic design for a while. And then I realized that I liked the technology tools that creative people used to do their work just as much as I liked doing the actual work. So over the course of I don't know, sort of maybe 5 years or so, when I was in my late 20s, I started supporting creative people's technology needs more than doing the creative work myself. And that sort of led me to a career in technology and led me over the course of I don't know, a couple decades into a place where I went from sort of technology executor, technology strategist, ultimately to a technology advisor. And through the course of a couple corporate M&As and my company sort of becoming a smart cities company, which I can talk about more, it led me to real estate. And I found myself here maybe 7, 8 years ago. And it's a great place to be. I get real excited by cities and by buildings and by delivering, thinking about how we can use technology to deliver great experiences for people who are going to use those buildings.
I'm curious, are there overlaps in your experience from perhaps printed material to the digital screen to buildings? Given your perspective, what, if anything, are some of the recurring themes that apply to both the graphics as well as how you think about real estate?
It's a great question. I mean, the funny answer is I can't create a PowerPoint deck without, sweating all the teeny little details in terms of what it looks like. It's sort of almost like I wish I didn't have the background that I have sometimes, because it sometimes gets in the way of me trying to get a presentation out the door. But it's about the little details, I guess, and it's about establishing a big picture vision of what you're trying to accomplish. In graphic design, you're trying to solve communication problems with words and pictures and color. In real estate, we're building these massive buildings or neighborhoods or districts. There's that element of scale, right? It's like there's the big picture. How do you take it all in? And then, okay, what are the little details that you can get right in order to achieve that big picture vision? So I don't know, maybe that's a parallel between visual design and technology strategy.
I'm by no means a graphic designer, but I do have an appreciation for some of these overlaps. You study composition and padding and kerning and typography and color and sequencing. And I relate that to, I guess, the process of designing a building and how you have to think about sequence and composition and space and hierarchy and whatnot. And perhaps maybe to even extrapolate, I don't know if I'm going too far, but the way you design a company, you recently started M5 after what I would consider to be a storied career in development. Now, as you grow M5, how are you taking some of the lessons learned in your graphic, real estate? How are you thinking about the future as you grow M5?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to something you said a minute ago, which is actually really interesting, and maybe we'll talk about for 1 second before I answer your question, which is, if you think about creative tools, that's actually a really interesting parallel, what you said, which is if I rewind, I don't know, 15 or 20 years, we saw desktop publishing tools, technology, essentially displacing what was previously an analog and manual process, right? And tools like PageMaker and Quark Express, and now it's all about InDesign. These are tools that are used to create visual design layouts. Those tools got a lot smarter over time. You mentioned the word kerning. When I was 20 something years old, I used to sit there and manually kern type in Quark Express, which literally means, for those that don't know, like the space in between individual letters in a layout, literally going letter by letter through a poster, for example, and like manually tweaking the space in between every single character in that design. And then, all of a sudden Adobe came out with a tool that like did that automatically and very well. And it had optical kerning and automatic kerning tools. Anyways, that's one sort of in the weeds example. But if you think about how buildings get designed, right? And I'm sure, Jose, you like this is near and dear to your heart as well. Like the tools that we use to design buildings have gotten so much more powerful, so much smarter. Things like BIM and digital twins and like all of the tools that are used now to design buildings have freed up our time as creators, ultimately to hopefully mean that we can do our jobs even more efficiently and get more done and create even better outcomes. So I don't know, it's just like a really interesting comment you had there about like the tools we use and the pipeline to get the work done.
And I do think about these things and, as opposed to thinking about it as kind of graphic design, building design. And often I take a lot of the lessons learned in graphic or editing or even the way we approach designing a building to how do we design a company. I would consider myself kind of like you, where I guess to my detriment, spacing, padding, sequencing, kerning of letters would probably prevent me from getting something out. Of course, I'm learning a little bit of like how to let go. But to your credit, I think there's so much overlap there. Is that just some of the basic universal principles of design?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, you asked me about M5 and like what we do and kind of what the genesis was. I mean, I think just to give you a little background on like what the company does. Until recently, I was head of digital experience innovation for Brookfield Properties. So I worked across Brookfield's global real estate platform, really focused on like property technology, digital experience. I ran a program at Brookfield called our Digital Master Planning Program, which is all about digital strategy and planning through the real estate development process. And so today, now M5 is my advisory firm. We essentially, our mission is to provide great experience outcomes for our clients and their tenants and their residents and their shoppers. So we're a digital advisory firm, and we take a very sort of design-centered, user-centered approach to technology planning, really thinking about how do we deliver great experiences, how do we achieve the investor or developer's desired, sort of investment outcomes, and where's the opportunity for those things to overlap to sort of realize great experiences, great sort of technology powered experiences in these buildings.
You're on the front row of this. I mean, talk to me. What are you hearing from commercial landlords today? Like, what chapter are we in commercial real estate? It's like, how are they actually deploying technology? It's a broad term, but what are some of the questions they're looking to solve, and how are you connecting that with some of the technology out today?
Well, I'm doing a lot of work on real estate, sort of commercial real estate development right now. If you think about commercial real estate development, I advise on a lot of mixed, like urban mixed use projects. All of these digital platforms that people carry around and on the devices in their pockets, right? We're all accustomed to being able to order food anywhere with, Uber Eats, or accustomed to being able to call a car with Lyft or Uber to right where we are. We expect really accurate navigation and wayfinding with Google Maps. We expect to be able to pay now. Apple Pay has really become almost ubiquitous over the last few years. All of these things are the sort of capabilities that I would say consumers expect today. And commercial real estate is building the environments and the places of the future. And so I think that it is our responsibility to deliver and build environments in which all of those digital experiences can work successfully. So in terms of, to answer your question, I think, if you think about, parking technology, tenant engagement platforms, if you think about designing environments for pickup and drop off via these platforms, if you think about being able to go, access control and integrating at the turnstile, et cetera, like this is the realm or sort of the breadth of all of the types of technologies and experiences that we think about. And they're all rooted in connectivity. And so telecom, wireless connectivity is kind of at the core of a lot of the work that we're focused on today. How are we delivering and designing great connectivity platforms to enable all of these things, all of these experiences that consumers are going to expect in the buildings? So that's a big theme for us in the last few years.
I'd imagine most folks do not disagree, right? We want to be connected. We want it easier to do payments, and have better experiences. But what do you find are some of the perhaps biggest challenges or roadblocks to rolling out some of this technology across, whether it's a particular space or across portfolios?
I would say commercial real estate, as the last few years and the economy and sort of the current kind of trends in the industry have shown us, commercial real estate is ultimately driven by investment returns at the end of the day, right? That's why that's sort of at the core of the industry. It can be very hard to design a financial model that proves that the investment in delivering a great experience to the people who are going to live or work or shop in a building is worth it. We all know that like it's the best experience to be able to walk up to a turnstile and tap your phone and within a fraction of a second have the turnstile unlock and let you through, right? Like in my mind, that's like that's what we should be aiming for. Okay, that involves a lot of technology, and it involves assumptions about the devices people carry. It involves putting an app on those or a wallet pass on those devices. It involves putting technology in the turnstiles like NFC. It involves integration with the building system. I mean, it just involves a lot. Could you do it with Bluetooth? Sure. Would it be as good an experience? I would argue probably not. So there's all and these types of like horse trading and value engineering conversations come up over and over through the development process. Why do we need to use this technology? Wouldn't this one be less expensive? This vendor is telling us that. So it can be really hard to put an ROI model together for delivering a great experience outcome. So we try to look for experiences and solutions that both deliver a great experience and have sort of like a clear either ROI model or operational savings or sort of the business side of this that's ultimately going to convince the underwriters and the financial stakeholders that like the decisions are the right ones. But it's really hard. And we can't always get the solutions that we want because they don't always make sense or pencil at the end of the day. So I would say that's like a big challenge that we're constantly dealing with. And we've had to get creative in thinking about how to solution this stuff sometimes. I would just say the other thing to answer your question is in terms of like challenges, I think that digital, if you think about the commercial real estate development process, you've got this, typically you have a design phase where you've got a lot of different design teams sitting around a big sort of like three-sided table, U-shaped table, and you've got an architect of record and a design architect, and you've got all the specialized trades like mechanical and civil engineering. You've got like all these folks sitting around a big table, right? I would argue that digital and technology deserves a seat at that table from early in the development process and the design process, because then we can sort of make sure that we're incorporating the types of solutions and experiences that we want to be part of the building into the design documents. And that's how you set yourself up best to make sure things actually get realized at the end of the day. It can be a lot harder to come in late and try to add something to the budget, right? Versus getting it in early. So I think that's another sort of lesson learned around how to be successful.
You mentioned a few things. You mentioned like smart access, having the ability to just kind of use our smartphones to walk in. What are some of the Can you list out maybe some of the table stakes technology that, like, say, in the next 5, 10 years, like buildings have to have them, or else, owners are falling so behind that, it's no longer an attractive building to be in.
I mean, a lot of it is obvious to any of us to walk into any type of commercial building at any point. If we live in a multifamily apartment building in a city, or if we work in an office building, great connectivity, and I would argue great wireless connectivity is table stakes. I'm sure you've had the experience of being on a phone call or streaming something on your phone, walking into a building, getting on the elevator and having the call drop or losing the connection, right? Like it's so common that we've all had it. Or I'll give you another great example. You drive into the underground parking garage and need to use an app on your phone in order to like connect to an EV charger, for example, but you have no service underground. Like these are all like, it's so obvious. Anybody listening is probably like, well, of course you need it. But I would argue like it is table stakes, and commercial real estate does not do it well today. And there's still a huge opportunity for improvement there. So that's one. Some of the other themes we're working at, a lot of the time we're spending now focused on EV charging infrastructure deployment. I mentioned that a minute ago, but city by city, region by region, there are rules and regulations that municipalities are putting in place around building new parking and what percentage of spaces need to be have EV chargers or be EV ready. So that's a big theme. Another one is engagement. platforms. So what's the future of buildings and the way that buildings engage with and interact with their tenants in those buildings? So especially in like a commercial office building, if you work in a commercial building, maybe you have an app on your phone that lets you do stuff in that building. Or if you live in an apartment building, maybe the landlord is giving you an app that lets you pay your rent or book an amenity space or put a ticket in if there's something wrong or you need something, right? Like I would say the entire realm of tenant apps is like a really interesting place right now as we think about what the future of communication and the relationship between the operator of the building and the people who use the building are. And so that's a place that we've been spending a lot of time as well.
You alluded to this earlier, the amount of different technologies and different vendors and different value propositions. What framework do you use as a way to kind of siphon through the noise when considering what to make an investment on? What is maybe some of the basic criteria you use to think about this?
I think you need different stakeholders and different champions for different elements of the evaluation or of the criteria, as you said. Like there's the usability, right? If you're talking about an app or something that a tenant or a resident in a building is going to be using day to day, like there's the usability of that tool and how well does it perform and how, we have pretty high expectations. I would say consumers have pretty high expectations, especially as we use like the Google apps and the Uber apps and the, sort of all these apps that have big development teams that have been working on them for years, and they work pretty well, and they like take advantage of all the latest and greatest APIs and SDKs that our mobile platforms have to offer. So what's the usability like? That's a big one. There's extensibility and integration. How are these solutions going to integrate with existing building systems?
I just find it fascinating as we navigate the landscape. These are not small investments.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's always a kind of a small window of time to make those investments, right? You
Right.
mentioned the importance of bringing a seat to the table for folks thinking about digital technology early in the design process. So as you're talking, I'm just thinking about like, well, as we think about the next wave of presumably renovations within buildings, like how important it is to get this message out, right? To making sure that we're starting from the design phase, thinking about how do we employ these different apps, technologies, turnstiles, hardware, software, et cetera.
Yeah. And, I was going to mention earlier, there's another element to this, which I was going to mention, which is I think in real estate, I've worked on the other side, right? I've worked for like a solution provider to the real estate industry previously with a lot of really creative, multidisciplinary teams of designers and developers and engineers and strategists. And like that world there's a lot of camaraderie in the teams that are building and developing solutions. If you flip to the buyer side, which I'm on now, or the sort of real estate side, often, I always joke like the role of innovation in commercial real estate can be a pretty lonely role. Like if you have a team, you're lucky. Oftentimes you may be one among a massive organization and you're constantly swimming upstream, right? And so in terms of thinking about solutions and finding out what is the state of the art and what are, like sort of what works, what doesn't, I would say also, most of commercial real estate does not like to be first to the table when it comes to new technology. Commercial real estate likes to be fast followers once things have been proved out by sort of people who are willing to take the risk. Real estate is very risk averse, as I'm sure you know. And so having a great network of peers, I've found to be incredibly invaluable. Being able to reach out to other folks at other commercial real estate firms who are bringing new technology in, having a great peer group, being able to reach out and say, hey, has anyone heard of this vendor? Has anyone worked with this guy? What do we think are the top 3 solutions in the space, whatever it might be, carbon reporting or whatever it might be. Like it's extremely valuable. And I consider myself lucky to have a great peer group that I can ask questions like that. So
To put myself in the shoes of a commercial landlord, presumably someone or a team that owns and manages several locations, to maybe zoom out for a second. On the one hand, we've got rising regulation, things like, as you mentioned, carbon reporting, et cetera. We've got an economy that's telling us we need, more housing, less offices. We have rising interest rates and cost of construction going up higher than ever. It seems like we're in the perfect storm for a commercial landlord. There's short-term concerns like, how am I going to pay my mortgage with, several floors empty? The thought of renovating those spaces is a pretty costly endeavor. And then in addition to that, you've got kind of state and federal regulations rising to say, hey, you actually got to, report on your emissions, et cetera. Help me understand what's technology's role in this kind of perfect storm that an owner's having to consider. Are there ways that technology can play a role perhaps hardware, software, however specific you want to get in addressing any of these?
I think it goes back to something we talked about at the top of the conversation when I was talking about graphic design and how the tools have gotten more sophisticated and like it comes down to enabling like us to do more with less, right? Us to enable like the people who ultimately are either making decisions about buildings, strategy about how to develop those buildings, repurpose those buildings, or the people who are needing to report, as you said, on like GHG emissions within those, whatever it may be. Technology, you know, in many ways is sort of an accelerator and can enable an individual to do more, be more efficient, to do more with less. I'll give you an interesting example. Brookfield has an incredible digital twin platform for many of its buildings in New York City. And one of the flagship mixed use developments is Manhattan West, which is on the west side of Midtown of Manhattan. And there's a number of, there's like, I don't know, four or five. I think there's four towers, two very tall glass towers that are commercial office buildings. And those buildings have an incredibly powerful digital twin system that was stood up through the construction process and then became an operational tool for that building. And the reason the reason this is relevant to, I think, what you're asking is when you tour those buildings with the chief engineer, he walks around with an iPad and he can take you into a machine room on the 79th floor and he can look at and this is where you're going to know I'm not an engineer. He can look at a valve or some form of, like sort of back of house mechanical equipment that to me makes no sense because that's not my, I can't even pretend to begin to understand how the mechanical systems work in buildings. But he can look at those pieces of equipment with the iPad and zoom in on a piece of equipment and show me the entire maintenance history, who installed it, when its end of life needs to be. I mean, it's quite powerful, right? And again, like I think if you think about what that disrupted or has replaced, it's replaced a massive room in the basement of a building with tons of huge, rolls of like sort of plotter printouts of drawings of each floor that people are referencing and having to go look at. And so in this case, technology is like a accelerator and allows those engineers to do more with less, and ultimately means that they have this incredible historical record of the building so that we can avoid mistakes and guesswork in the future, right? And so that's just one example, but I think there are similar examples in the space of, as we said, sustainability or of investment strategy or whatever, that allow individuals to be, sort of more rapidly make decisions based on data and based on what they understand of the real estate assets.
5 years from now, when we walk into a commercial building, ideally we're walking into a space that provides an incredible experience, makes it easy to perhaps gain access to what you need to get access, perhaps make it easy to get things like deliveries and packages and understand the parts, pieces, and components of the building. Today, is there an example of, you mentioned Manhattan West, are you seeing examples become more common of like what a building should be? Are there particular buildings you can point to, or perhaps particular projects you've been a part of that have been kind of a smashing success? It's like, hey, here's what the future likely looks like.
Yeah, I mean, the Manhattan West example that we just spoke about, the digital twin example, I think is a really, really interesting one. And it required, a pretty big leap of faith on Brookfield's behalf several years ago to like invest in these technologies and ultimately continue to support them through, 5+ years of development. I'll give you a good example, Jose, which is in the retail sector. I've done a lot of work for leading retail developers who build lifestyle centers and have a very personal approach to the shoppers and to the customers at those centers. And some of the most innovative stuff I've seen happen in that world is, the landlord or ultimately the operator of that property is always looking for ways to have more direct relationships with the shoppers and the consumers at that property. Because if you think about like malls and retail in general, our relationship is with the retailer, with the store we go to, right? If I go to a shopping center, there's a pretty good chance I have no idea whose shopping center I'm in and I have no relationship with them, right? On the flip side of that, now that I'm put myself back in the real estate operator seat, data is power. And I want to know as much as I can about my shoppers, even if those shoppers are here to go to Lululemon or Alo Yoga or the Apple Store or wherever they're going, right? So I think some of the most interesting stuff I've worked on the retail side are around thinking really outside the box and strategically around ways that the landlord and the operator of the property can build relationships with the people who are there. And this applies to other sectors too. It applies to mixed use and office as well. If you think about what are my assets as the owner of the building? If I can't engage directly with people when they're in stores, what can I do? And you start to think about things like parking, and you start to think about public plazas and public realm, and you think about indoor corridors and elevators, and start to think about how do I leverage all of this sort of what I like to think of as like the connective tissue of the property to build relationships and to capture data about performance and the property where I can. And so some of the things we see are like digital signage is a big one in that space, like putting digital signage in places where it's going to maximize exposure and can drive revenue, but also provide useful information to the people who are on the property, whether it's wayfinding or events, et cetera. Another example would be like a loyalty, like a marketing driven loyalty program where if we think about the retail example, Jose is coming to shop and he's a valued shopper. I'd love to know that he's on the property, and I'd love to know that I can delight him with some, form of like, thank you for coming, whether it's like a free coffee or free parking or whatever. And so these types of like loyalty programs that can reward shoppers are really interesting. And I've worked on a few that integrate with credit card networks in really interesting ways and deliver great experiences for people as well. So those are a couple like varied examples. I guess what's the common thread? It's that landlords and developers are needing to think more like digitally native companies rather than like traditional real estate landlords and developers who tend to think in terms of concrete and construction materials, et cetera. So I don't know. Those are a few examples that I think of in terms of innovative stuff that we see coming down the pike.
Is AI at all on top of mind as you think about new kind of technologies and services to implement?
Yeah. I mean, it's all anybody wants to talk about. It's all every conference has a massive track in AI yet. I think or nowadays, I use tools day to day. I'm sure you do too. I've found that many of the generative AI platforms are incredibly powerful at helping, again, when one person do more with less, like we can be more efficient with these tools. So I think that's where we're seeing the greatest inroads now is like in terms of efficiency and in terms of doing our jobs more effectively and efficiently. I do think, and maybe germane to your world as well, some of the generative design tools are really interesting in terms of helping design teams. I've looked at a lot of them, haven't implemented or operationalized any yet. I think, again, it's sort of a bit of the bleeding edge. And I think we're seeing more teams that are less risk averse sort of just start to experiment with these tools. But the idea that a single designer could, have a tool spit out 100 master plan layouts for master plan designs, for example, and maybe one of them is an idea that I hadn't thought of before. And the tool isn't going to necessarily make me irrelevant, but it's going to, help me get me sort of maybe expose me to some ideas that I didn't have before. Maybe it can help me with a feasibility study to think through an idea better. Maybe it can get me 80% of the way to something that then I can spend my time focusing on the remaining 20%. I mean, I think it's really interesting how we're seeing some of this affect the design world on the real estate side in particular.
Let's close out these sessions by asking kind of a question in reverse. We spend quite a bit of time talking about the future and technology and what we'll likely be using. Oftentimes it feels a little overwhelming, right? It's like, as soon as you adopt something, there's probably something else coming. But maybe to think about the opposite end, what's likely not going to change in the next 10, 20 years about the way that we engage with our buildings, whether we're in 2024 or 1994 or 20 years in the future. What do you think is likely not going to change about the way we engage with buildings?
It's so interesting. I mean, maybe I'll come back to what I said at the top and something we talked a little bit about already, which is the tenants and residents and shoppers who use these buildings are ultimately the ones who we need to cater to as we develop buildings. And so what's not going to change is that consumer expectations are going to continue to change. And right. And so we need to be flexible and we need to understand and plan for changing consumer expectations and try to, from a technology planning perspective, that means trying to be as flexible as possible in terms of the solutions we put into the building and have an eye on the state of the art and what may be coming down the road so that we can, adapt extend, integrate, retrofit systems as consumer habits and preferences change in the future. I could make a lot of great guesses about what our phones are going to look like or do in 5 or 10 years, and whether we're going to be walking around with smart glasses or who knows what. But I think the truth is, like, a lot of that is guesswork today. And what we can do to be smart and risk averse is just to plan as flexibly as possible for changing consumer preferences in the future.
This has been super fun. If folks want to follow your work, where can they find you? Or how can they follow your work?
Find me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to connect. Always interested in sharing, stories about what we're doing, or hearing from developers or landlords that are doing interesting things that we may be able to help with or have interesting conversations about. So yeah, thanks, Jose. It's been a really good conversation. I appreciate it.